Good afternoon. My name is Brendan McConville. I'm the head of the David Center for the American Revolution at APS. Some of you I know, some of you I'm looking forward to meeting, but I'm very happy to welcome you both in person and streaming live to this afternoon's lunch at the library, which will feature Ned Donoghue speaking about the research that led to his book, Prisoners of Congress, Philadelphia Quakers in Exile, 1777-1778. Today's lecture is sponsored by the David Center for the American Revolution. The David Center is a collaboration between the David Library of the American Revolution and the American Philosophical Society, which are now sort of in a merger relationship, and is dedicated to supporting scholarship on the American Revolution. The David Library's founder, Saul Feinstein, believed that the examination of the Founding Fathers' values and the events of the revolutionary period was essential to creating an informed citizenry, able to comprehend and adapt the founding principles to the ever-evolving and changing circumstances of American society. The Center keeps Saul Feinstein's vision alive by championing the active engagement of scholars, educators, and the general public of all ages in a continuing and dynamic encounter, I think, with this most central episode in the creation of the American nation. If you're interested in Saul Feinstein, who was also an avid collector of material from the American Revolution, the two cases up front here have documents from his collection which are related to today's talk. Come on up and take a look at them. They really are fascinating. I think you'll enjoy it. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd like to draw your attention to two upcoming events sponsored by the David Center. The first will be next Wednesday, September 27th, and will again feature Ned Donoghue, who will be delivering an evening talk at Washington Crossing, the original home of the David Library. It was right up the road from the Washington Crossing national site there. So if you have any friends who aren't able to attend today's program, or if you're online and watching and you want to come out and be a part of the audience, please do so. As I said, it'll be in Bucks County, and it'll be an evening talk at Washington Crossing. I also hope that you'll consider joining us in our online seminar series. Throughout the year, the David Center has papers that we have, Zoom sessions, papers online that have the general discussion, presentation of work, and we love when people join us. The next of these is on October 11th at 3 p.m. It will take place on Zoom, and there's more information about the seminar, which focuses on the American Revolution, on the APS website. But we really want people to participate, and we'll hope you'll be able to log in and sort of participate in the discussions and see the discussions of these papers. But with all of that, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today. Ned Donoghue is an independent scholar, educated at Williams College and Duke Law School. He's had a varied career. He practiced law for 34 years in Philadelphia in an international firm, then joined the staff of the Philadelphia Orchestra as a fundraiser during their campaign to endow the orchestra. As a volunteer professional, he served on the board of We the People 200, which was a nonprofit which helped organize celebrations of the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1987, which I remember quite well, but now seems a long time ago. The national celebration in Philadelphia, they were part of that and played a central role in all that. He also has played a central role, which we were chatting with before the talk here now, in the Princess Grace Foundation USA, which is a sustainer of the performing arts, particularly for younger people. It really is a fabulous foundation, and Ned has been involved with them for decades. It really has been, it's really an impressive and kind of touching thing, I think, because it really shows a kind of commitment to a broad cultural, a broad and lively culture, and it really, on Ned's part, I think it's just, it shows a fantastic commitment to the public good and to the development of young people. He served on the ladder in the Princess Grace Foundation for over 40 years until his retirement last month. And again, it just is so impressive to me to see people devote their time and energy to this kind of foundation to help young people in the performing arts. His research is primarily in the field of pacifism in Pennsylvania during the American Revolution. and his new book, which is the subject of the talk today, published by Penn State University Press, is entitled, as you can see from the poster here, Prisoners of Congress, Philadelphia Quakers in Exile, 1777-1778. It will be on sale in the back of the room after the talk. Patrick Sparrow, who many of you know, Pat, of course, he was the former librarian and director of the APS, has written of Ned's book that it, and I quote, brings to life one of the most important and compelling events of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and that it is an untold story of national significance. And I would second those words. With that, please join me in welcoming Ned to the lunch at the library.
Thank you, Brendan. That was a very gracious introduction, and I appreciate it. I want to introduce somebody, too. And she's the one to whom I dedicated the book. It's my wife, Peggy O'Donnell. And because I can't chew gum and think at the same time, she's going to advance the slides. Franklin and Quakers. For a period of time in 1777, Quakers were reviled by patriots and others in Philadelphia, known as the Quaker City, but revered in Paris, known as the City of Light, where Philadelphia's astute Benjamin Franklin, America's first diplomatic envoy, was laboring on its behalf. Franklin, trying to win support for massive assistance by the French nation to the new republic in its war for independence, was definitely not a Quaker. But the French, knowing he was from Philadelphia, mistakenly thought he must be a Quaker anyway. So he played it up. Why? Because the great French philosophe, Monsieur de Voltaire, had written very favorably of Philadelphia Quakers decades before as models of private virtue, honesty, and purity in religious life. Franklin wanted some of that. By cultivating a Quaker image, wearing plain clothes and a coonskin hat, he encouraged the popular notion that he too shared in these virtues, contributing toward his achievement of the massive assistance he sought and the United States received. Yet another resounding international success from Franklin. When I turned 50 in 1994, do the math, I read Philadelphian Catherine Drinker Bowen's memoir, Family Portrait. She related that her father, Henry Drinker, a brilliant lawyer and engineer, and then president of Lehigh University, was descended from an 18th century namesake Quaker. Henry Drinker was a central figure in my book. To Bowen's father's great chagrin and embarrassment, this earlier Henry Drinker and 19 others had been exiled from Philadelphia to Virginia, Bowen wrote, for refusing to bear arms in the Revolution. This statement confounded me. I knew it had to be for much more than that. Contemporary Pennsylvanians knew that Quakers were pacifists. I filed Bowen's comment away for investigation on a future day, a day which came nearly 20 years later. During the Revolutionary War, most people knew about the Quaker exile, but they only knew a small sliver of it. Until now, no historian has written a comprehensive scholarly examination of the extended Quaker exile, and only a rare few scholars have known a fraction of what this book reveals. Now to the story. Politics and religion are a volatile combination, whether in 2023 or in 1777. The same is particularly true when individual civil liberties come into conflict with a perceived threat to national security. These conflicts are at the core of the narrative here. Long the preeminent power in Pennsylvania, in 1776, the Quakers found themselves out of step with revolutionary sentiments. though the general population was well aware of their refusal to bear arms, to patriot leaders in 1777, this minority religious sect, comprising then only 15% of the population of the city, now constituted a serious, persistent, and perhaps existential security threat to the new republic and the state in which they lived. On September 11th, 1777, the Second Continental Congress and the government of the newly organized state of Pennsylvania exiled 20 men. 17 of the exiles were Quakers, 2 were disowned former Quakers, and 1 was a never Quaker. Their objections to the revolution and the war were sincere, religiously rooted, and courageous. Though they were never formally accused or convicted of any crime, the exiles were arrested and summarily banished with no chance to be heard in their own defense for an indefinite period to a frontier village in Virginia. They were also stripped of traditional rights held sacred for centuries, particularly that bundle of rights embodied by habeas corpus, the right to be heard by an impartial judge and released if he found them to be illegally arrested, which the Quakers strongly believed was the case. Now, if I may jump to the darkest hours of their imprisonment, a passage from the book. The last days of February 1778 brought rain, snow, hail, and ice to the frontier town of Winchester, Virginia, where a group of Quaker men had been held since their banishment from Philadelphia 6 months earlier. Illness proliferated, and relief was unlikely to arrive in time, even for those exiles who, like Henry Drinker, suffered relatively minor afflictions. On March 2, Thomas Gilpin, a 50-year-old husband, father, milling entrepreneur, merchant, and scientist, whose invention of a hydraulic pump had delighted Benjamin Franklin, became the first of the Quaker exiles to die. Days later, a second exile, 62-year-old Quaker minister John Hunt, experienced a mortification of one leg. It had suddenly lost all utility. Doctors concluded that amputation was the only way to save Hunt's life. When it came time to perform the operation, the only surgeon available had a curious history of inebriation and, unlike the pacifist Hunt, had served as a major general in George Washington's army. Hunt survived the operation without anesthetic, and his condition briefly seemed to improve. He too, however, would die before the month was out. March 1778 represented the absolute nadir of the Quaker sect's 96 years of political life in Pennsylvania. After nearly a century, as the predominant cultural force in the colony and state, its members were out of office, out of influence, and out of business. Some struggled to survive out of their native state, where they were out of supplies and nearly out of luck. They were at the lowest ebb of their powers. Although in some sense they had never felt so helpless, the Quakers remained stalwart in their faith and strict in their religious principles. John Hunt, a pious man, had prepared himself for martyrdom. Still, he must have wondered as he lay dying how he and his co-religionists, who had not been accused of any crimes by either the Continental Congress or the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, had ended up in this situation and how it would all end. The questions raised by the book are many, but the major ones, where civil liberties conflict with national security, are these 4. First, what can you do when your city is about to be invaded by the most effective army in the Western Hemisphere, and among your neighbors you suspect but cannot prove there may be powerful men who favor the enemy, and they've told you that they are neutral? Secondly, what duties do citizens owe their duly elected government? And what level of protection of the law does that government owe to supposed citizens who refuse it any show of allegiance and refuse to share in its burdens by paying taxes? Third, can people claiming the moral high ground by insisting that they were just following strict religious principles expect others to ignore the political implications of their actions? Fourth, to what extent do governments have the right during wartime to restrict the rights of certain groups when they feel it necessary for public safety and/or national security? This was indeed a confusing time, illustrating what historian Gary Nash called the messiness of the American Revolution. Prisoners of Congress tells this story of the American Revolution in Philadelphia from the vantage point of 4 Quaker families affected by the Exile: the Pembertons, the Fishers, the Gilpins, and the Drinkers. Here's Israel Pemberton, the eldest, who was a transatlantic merchant, a Quaker activist, often called the king of the Quakers in derision by non-Quakers. This is from a political cartoon. Second, James, a transatlantic merchant and a politician. John, Quaker minister and a transatlantic merchant. And Samuel Pleasance, a transatlantic merchant who married Mary Pemberton, Israel's daughter. The Fishers, Thomas and Myers Fisher. Their brother Samuel Fisher was also exiled. They had a brother-in-law who married Sister Lydia, and we'll meet him later. Sister-in-law Sarah R. Fisher was married to Myers Fisher. And lastly, the Drinkers. Henry Drinker, a transatlantic merchant and an ironmaster, and Elizabeth Drinker, mother of 6 young children and a thoughtful diarist. She kept a detailed diary for 49 years. Here are 3 supporters of the exiles: John Parrish, Owen Jones, and Isaac Zane. Perhaps you can recognize Quakers by the dress code. Most patriots recognize the Quaker peace testimony as a valid reason for exempting Quakers from military service. But now the military, forming to defend the city, insisted that the pacifists pay for that privilege. Quakers, however, adamantly refused to pay for it or participate in the common defense of the city, state, and nation in more than a dozen documented ways. They rejected the continental currency, refused to affirm their allegiance to the new government, even refused the government's request that they donate blankets, for which compensation was offered, to comfort the soldiers who were sleeping in nearby camps. This may have been a tipping point. They refused as well to yield up the lead in the weights of their tall case clocks and in their gutters. They also refused to recognize the legitimacy of the newly elected government of Pennsylvania. Quakers, meanwhile, also continued to sing the praises of their history of prosperity within the British Empire, never evincing any interest in changing the colony's status, and certainly not in a violent way, all to the increasing anger and resentment of fellow citizens. The summer of 1777. Quaker sufferings mounted through the summer of 77, when the patriots periodically declared a day of fast to celebrate a win or take pride in what they had done. Quakers refused to participate. As a matter of fact, they had never engaged in any such celebrations, even in colonial times. On July 4th, 1777, the first anniversary of independence, the city was illuminated at night, with patriots everywhere placing lit candles in their windows. This cadre of Quaker leaders, however, believed that the patriots had illegally usurped the positions of the rightful British government, and they did not illuminate their windows. Dark windows became a sign of a Quaker family that was not celebrating, a provocation to patriots, and possibly another tipping point. On that night, Sarah Logan Fisher and her husband Thomas had 15 windows broken in their house. Quaker minister Nicholas Waln, 14. William Logan, also a Quaker, 50 panes. Elizabeth Drinker recorded, quote, a great number of windows broke at her home. As overzealous patriots rioted outside his home, future exile Elijah Brown remembered that it was as if he were in a jail, in an apartment in which my chambers were hourly woken by the clanking of chains and bolts and iron doors. That night likely spawned in his son, Charles Brockton Brown, then age 6, the seeds of the nation's first Gothic novels he would write in ensuing decades. It was a scary night for this group of dissidents and their families. Later, on August 28th, John Hancock at the Continental Congress received a letter from Major General John Sullivan, who claimed to have evidence that Quaker members of the Spanktown Yearly Meeting in Rahway, New Jersey, had purportedly transmitted military intelligence to the British Army. If true, this was highly shocking and possibly treasonous. But it was not true, and they were forged papers. These so-called Spanktown papers were clearly faked. A Spanktown Yearly Meeting did not even exist, and they were not written in the pure and constant Quaker style. Yet they became the pretext for an attack against all Quakers in America. Congress insisted the Spanktown papers be printed in all the newspapers, along with Quaker internal policy statements that made them look as if they might be acting hostile to the new order of things. The Patriots refused to afford the Quakers even a basic hearing, and nor could the Quakers manage to have a rebuttal printed. Patriots framed the Quakers with the fake news. Responding to the Spanktown papers, Congress charged a 3-man committee on spies, the most important member of which was John Adams, to consider Sullivan's charges. Sullivan said the Quakers have a network all over the colonies, and they must be using this network to relay military intelligence to the British. So it was a pretty shocking thing. The 3-man committee's hastily composed report, delivered to the full Congress later that same day, did not uncover who had written the Spanktown papers, who was responsible, but instead merely concluded, most likely on preconceived notions, that a large number of Quakers were enemies to America, who, if given the chance, would surely collude with the British to undermine the Patriot cause. Translated into today's language, the Congressional Committee identified these men as a serious threat to national security, although they didn't have that terminology at the time. The quickly assembled report went on to recommend that certain named Quaker men in Philadelphia be arrested and confined and their political papers seized. These men's names were not even on the documents, and they weren't connected with it. The following day, Congress instructed the Pennsylvania Executive Council, they were both meeting in Independence Hall, to apprehend and secure the 11 men Adams' committee had named. The Pennsylvania Council added 30 names to the list because they had been keeping a secret list of people who were hostile to the new government. And they decided to arrest 41 men. But in none of the cases did they allege any specific act worthy of arrest. Indeed, no direct accusations of criminality were ever made. Nonetheless, the arrests began on September 2, with general warrants signed not by a judge, but by the council, the executive function of Pennsylvania. In an unusual move, the council chose a specially assembled group of 25 militia members instead of the sheriff to carry out the arrests, suggesting that its members understood the irregular nature of these arrests. Among their militia officers in the arresting party was an outstanding figure in Philadelphia history, assigned to execute the arrest warrant against Quaker minister John Pemberton, who Thomas Paine had accused as a traitor, was Captain Charles Wilson Peale, the famous portrait painter who later founded the first museum in Philadelphia. He thought what the arresting party was doing was so irregular that he tried to justify his actions in his diary, which still exists, to tell us what he felt in this highly irregular proceeding. Months later, he was to physically eject from her house the wife of the chief loyalist, Grace Groudon Galloway, so the patriots could use the house for diplomatic purposes. The arresting party offered many of its targets the first of several oaths of allegiance, any one of which, had the Quakers been willing to sign them, would have allowed them to avoid arrest. Only 8 of the 41 men, 3/4 of the 41 men were Quakers, took the oath and accepted parole. Soldiers searched the prisoners' desks for political papers, sometimes smashing the desks. They seized some Quaker testimonies and minutes. They took the minute book of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting from Henry Drinker's desk, as well as some additional public papers found on John Hunt and John Pemberton. The arresting party was also instructed to confiscate all firearms, swords, and bayonets discovered on the prisoners. No such weapons were found among any of the men who were arrested. At least one man, John Pemberton, called a traitor, resisted arrest and had to be forcefully removed from his home. This was a show of passive resistance. From the Freemasons' lodge, where the men were confined 9 days pending exile, the prisoners protested their treatment from several angles. First, they argued that the arrest warrants, which noted only that the men had, quote, evidenced a disposition hostile to the cause of America, end quote, and specified no crimes, were insufficient under the newly adopted Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. Clearly, these were illegal arrests. Secondly, they also pleaded repeatedly for a hearing at which they could explain and defend themselves and point out the problems with the Spanktown papers. My book carries on the frontispiece the final page of one of their eloquent protests with this plea. Quote, "We again repeat our pressing demand to be informed of the cause of our confinement and to have a hearing in the face of our country before whom we shall either stand acquitted or condemned." Followed by 22 signatures, it is an interesting parallel to those on the Declaration of Independence. I call this the Declaration of Quaker Protest. Let me repeat that demand. We again repeat our pressing demand to be informed of the cause of our confinement. Why were we arrested? And to have a hearing in the face of our country, before whom we shall either stand acquitted or condemned. Their opponents, however, were both unmoved and cunning. Members of Congress divested themselves of this responsibility by arguing that only the state could conduct such a hearing. Pennsylvania authorities, meanwhile, insisted that the imprisoned men were under the jurisdiction of Congress. They kept going back and forth. Previous historians have made much of the persecuted feelings of Quakers at this time. None, however, has yet been able to shine a light on the intense and desperate political plans by patriots to illegally suppress, punish, and sideline the Quaker leaders. What it amounted to was patriots borrowing from the authoritarian playbook of the enemy, Parliament in England. They borrowed techniques that in previous centuries were used by Parliament to support divine right monarchs. Their techniques included preventive detention, covered by the only suspension of habeas corpus law, in Pennsylvania's 245-year history, bills of attainder, a notorious legal shortcut for charging someone with treason, an ex post facto law, illegal arrests by the militia and not the sheriff, and without a proper warrant, political chicanery, there are many evidences, bullying and intimidation, obfuscation, coordinated between two levels of government, seizure of goods, and fake news, the Spanktown Papers. Patriots effectively triple silenced the Quakers, refusing them a hearing by Congress, the state, and the courts. By September 9, Congress ordered that the men be escorted by Pennsylvania militia guards to Virginia for an indefinite period of confinement. Late in the afternoon of September 11, the same day as the Battle of Brandywine, one of the longest and largest of the 8-year war just 40 miles to the west, wives and children of the Quakers wept profusely as the men were forced into wagons and carted away, led by armed guards, while patriots jeered these men deemed hostile to the government of the city and the new republic. Such a scene was not often witnessed in these parts. A 16-year-old Quaker boy wrote of his stepfather and others taken away. Of the government authorities and Congress, he cried, "Thou hast denied them in a manner more tyrannical and cruel than the Inquisition of Spain. They were dragged by a licentious mob from their near and dear connections, and by the hand of lawless power, banished from their country unheard, perhaps never more to return." Despite any discomfort its members may have felt, both Congress and the Council remained intransigent for 6 more months, rebuffing the over 35 protests, by my count, received from the exiles and their supporters. Ultimately, it took not only the persistent activism of over 150 named Quakers, but also a sympathetic nudge from George Washington to tip the scales in favor of release. Unique among the many activist Quakers were the actions of 18 wives, mothers, and sisters of the exiles. They rejected the text of a petition drafted by a male Quaker lawyer and instead drafted one themselves. That text, reproduced in the book as an appendix, is extraordinary in how its gendered tone differs from the many unsuccessful petitions drafted by the men. The book recounts how 4 of the Quaker women selected by the group turn a proposed trip to bring medical supplies to their confined husbands, sons, and brothers into a political mission to rescue the men. The 4 women whose names should be remembered, Susanna Sukey Jones, Phoebe Pemberton, Mary Pemberton Pleasance, and Elizabeth Sandwith Drinker, hand-delivered their petition to General Washington at Valley Forge and Pennsylvania authorities at Lancaster by traveling through the soldiers' lines of not one but 2 armies. At the encampment, Commander-in-Chief George Washington, having been briefed by his security staff on this unusual delegation, received the women cordially. Indeed, invited the 4 Quaker women to join his afternoon luncheon with 20 members of his general staff and his wife, but explained to the women he can't help them. It's out of his jurisdiction. After supper, the 4 women meet alone with Martha Washington, who had spent months visiting her husband. My research revealed that a member of Martha's extended family was closely related to Quaker exile martyr Thomas Gilpin, making an exchange of mutual sympathies and compassion highly likely. Hours later, Washington sent a letter to the Pennsylvania governor, ending with these 2 sentences. The women seem much distressed. Humanity pleads strongly in their favor. The Pennsylvania Council now feared that the dangerous example which the longer continuance of the prisoners in banishment may afford on future occasions had already given uneasiness to some good friends of the independence of these states. In the face of opposition among patriots, the governor and the council found that banishment upon suspicion alone only set a dangerous precedent. With the arrival of the Quaker Women's Mission in Lancaster, proceedings to release the exiled Quakers accelerated. The prisoners of Congress were finally released April 28, 1778. We are left then with these questions. How did the patriots justify the seemingly blatant hypocrisy inherent in their treatment of Quakers? By the way, the suspension of habeas corpus law was found to be unconstitutional in 1784. Were patriots guilty of overly zealous political chicanery, a betrayal of their own cause? Or were the patriots savvy strategists in finding a path to avoid potential collaborators causing worse harm from a tyrannical enemy, even if it meant using an illegal and unconstitutional ploy because so much was at stake? Did the ends justify the means? These are the hard questions that Pennsylvanians and citizens more broadly of the new republic faced in 1778. But I want to leave you with two final thoughts. First, Benjamin Franklin founded this venerable institution in 1743 as a vehicle for promoting useful knowledge. As an anecdotal measure of how important the Quakers were culturally to the founding values of this country, I combed the list of all the Quakers and patriots who appeared by name in my story and my associated research, and compared that list with all the couple hundred 18th century founding members of APS in a reference work called Patriot Improvers, with biographical sketches of them. What I found was that there were 12 men on the Quaker side of my story and an equal number on the Patriot, or at least the non-Quaker side of my story, who were among the founding APS members. Secondly, after having been deprived of their liberty unheard by their fellow countrymen, after what must have seemed like the most intensely unjust public calumny, punishment, and arbitrary rejection inherent in the episode, including the deaths of two of their closest colleagues, all 15 surviving Quakers made prisoners by Congress came home to Philadelphia. None moved elsewhere permanently. I hope prisoners of Congress will generate a dialogue on these many important issues, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Time for some questions, so if you want to ask Ned some questions, jump in. Yeah, go in the back.
I'm bringing a microphone to you.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So I'm just curious, about 2 weeks after September 11th, the British Army occupies Philadelphia. And what does the Quaker community think of that? Are they happy? Are they neutral? Are they not so happy? What?
Well, there's a variety of opinions. Some in their diaries seem to welcome it. The Quakers who were exiled were all the men, so their wives and families were here under the occupation. And after a couple of months, some British officers asked to quarter themselves on their homes. And they didn't have much of a choice under the circumstances. And certainly they were uncomfortable having men of war in the house. and certainly the patriots were watching every move. You can imagine the sets of eyes that were watching you if you were Quaker under occupied Philadelphia. So there were a lot of mixed emotions. And then they began to see the devastation that the British Army brought to at least 10 Quaker mansions in Philadelphia, owned by John Dickinson and others. And they saw that, things were a little chancy. One of the rumors was, including from Nathaniel Greene, a former Quaker just immediately under General Washington, he spread the rumor that the Quakers had paid a tribute of 20,000 pounds to General Howe, and that was repeated by Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the Methodist prelate, and I could never find any evidence of it, so we have to discount it as just a rumor, but there were a lot of things being said.
I have a question online, actually, and then we'll get to the one in here. There's a question from Robert Wong who asks, did this banishment occur in other cities? And if so, what were the outcome? Did Quakers leave for Canada like the Loyalists?
So a lot of the Quakers in the Philadelphia area who had Loyalist tendencies did flock to the British. They say about 3,000 of them, maybe 1,500 of which joined the British troops. And they evacuated with the British to New York, where the British provided ships to take them to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and other settlements they had in the Maritimes. And Quakers from Philadelphia sent emissaries up there in later years to check on their welfare and whether they repented or anything if they had contact with war, which violated the peace testimony. So there's a lot of literature on that.
Yeah, go ahead. You got a question?
There were certainly more than 19 Quaker men in Philadelphia at the time. How were those chosen who went to Virginia? How were they selected?
Good question. Thank you, Arthur. Most of them were members of the Meeting for Sufferings, which was the executive council and the publication arm of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And many of them were clerks of various committees, Meeting for Sufferings in the local congregations. And they were also, at the same time, the wealthiest transatlantic merchants with fine homes in the cities and second homes in the country and fine carriages. It was an elite group of Quaker transatlantic merchants who had ships going to London, the West Indies, and back to the colonies. So it was pretty unusual that they would be arrested because when the war was over later, they were going to have to depend on these captains of industry for employment and economic things. So that's why they didn't torture them. They didn't do a lot of things that might have been more harsh. But many of them thought even what they did was so harsh because they were sent away unheard, humiliated, and pariahs. And I think as men of industry, they must have resented that a great deal.
We're coming to you with a microphone so we can hear you online. Sorry.
Peggy Duckett.
Could you tell us a little bit about your path to writing this magnum opus of these four families and any personal connection
Thank you very much.
have?
Thank you. So when I was 5, my mother took me to preschool at a Quaker meeting house in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. And when she left me, she said, "Ned, these people don't believe in war." Well, that stuck with me as a contrarian statement, and I was always interested in Quakers and how they thought, because they thought differently about things, and they became agents of change in our society in a very upstanding way. So I moved to Westchester after that, and there were 2 Quaker meeting houses in Westchester, and at the edge of town there was a sign that said, "Westchester welcomes thee." So then I went to college and majored in history, went to law school, came back to Philadelphia, practiced law. Several of my clients were Quakers, and I always had that as an interesting focal point. And then I started doing family history research, and I was looking at my mother's German ancestors who emigrated in 1750. And one of them bought 3 land tracts in the 1790s from Henry and Elizabeth Drinker. And then after he died, his son went to pay the balance of the mortgage, came to Philadelphia from Western Maryland, knocked on the Drinkers' door, and they invited him in for breakfast. And he paid off the mortgage and found he didn't know about it, but his name was added to Elizabeth Drinker's journal because she named everybody who came to the house. And then he was also in the account books that Henry kept, which are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So I found being drawn to Henry Drinker, and he was one of the leading exiles, and I just had to pursue this, and I took 9 years out of my life to research it and write it.
Yeah, go ahead. Here, you can use this.
The industrialist John Roberts of Lower Merion Township was hung as a Quaker for foraging help to the British in 1778.
Well, he was hanged for more than that.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you to do, to comment on that and
Yeah.
to let us know. And there was another gentleman who was hung along with
Abraham
him.
Carlisle.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are other Quakers, however, who lost their life in this whole period of conflict.
Absolutely, sure. So when the exiles came back, the British were still occupying the city in April, but they left on June 18th, quickly went to New York at the behest of the king. And so the patriots were left in charge of the city once again, and they were looking around about who cooperated with the British. So they found 2 in particular, John Roberts, a miller, and Abraham Carlisle, who was a master carpenter and a member of the Carpenters' Company. So Abraham Carlisle, they found a letter from General Howe to him saying, "You're in charge of the North Gate." So he, the evidence was right there. As to John Roberts yacked too much. In a tavern one night with his friends, he told them that after the Battle of Brandywine, he was sympathetic to the men who were about to be exiled, so he rode his horse to Brandywine. He looked for Joseph Galloway, the chief loyalist, who was also General Howe's right-hand strategic guy, and he said, "Can he give me 25 light horse cavalry to go rescue the Quaker exiles?" And Howe thought about it for an hour, and he said, "I could, but I'm not going to spare those men. I have more important things to do." And so Roberts rode away dejected. And meanwhile, the Quakers, who were being escorted by the militia, held up the caravan at between Valley Forge and Reading at like Pottsgrove, and stayed overnight there, hoping John Roberts would have got his 25 cavalry to rescue them. So that's how that went down. And afterwards, they tried a lot of men, I think maybe 60 or 70, for treason, but only 2 got convicted, and they were both executed. Well, everybody thought after they were convicted that they would go to leniency and commute the conviction because it was just so shocking to this Pennsylvania audience. And, but no, the new government had to show that if we say, you know, do this to defend the city, you better help us. They had to make a point. And so they executed both men on the common on November the 4th, 1778. It was a sad day.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, go ahead. Come on with you for a moment.
Thank you. You mentioned that the Spanktown papers were reviewed by a three-man commission headed by John Adams.
Yeah.
The same John Adams who defended the British soldiers.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
This is a man, John Adams, who said, you know, these British soldiers at the Boston Massacre in 1770 deserved fair legal representation. But did he offer that to the Quakers? No.
So how long did it take them to determine that they were spurious, the papers? And that's number one. And number two, did John Adams ever speak up in Congress in favor of the exiles?
No, he didn't. But he was in charge of the exile as head of the Board of War, Congressional Board of War. And when somebody asked, instead of sending them to Stanton, Virginia, send them to Winchester, Virginia, he said, okay. But that's where they kept POWs. So and then John Adams was sent off as an envoy abroad, so he didn't have anything further to do until he got down to writing his memoirs in 1803 and said some unkind things about the Quakers, which they may have deserved.
Why don't you join with me in thanking Ned for a really stimulating talk?